Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm joined by Chris Johnstone. Many of you will know Chris. He's a stalwart in U.S. Japan and U.S. Asia policy in Washington. Careers in think tanks, the intelligence community, the Pentagon, the White House, CSIS, and now he is partner and chair of defense and national security practice at the Asia Group Consultancy, winner of the prestigious Ryozo Kato Prize for contributions to the U.S.-Japan Alliance. And throughout my career in government and beyond, a really trusted source of wisdom on Japan and the alliance. So Chris, we've had you on, but it's 3 years later. We need to check in again. A lot happening with Japan.
Great to be here, Mike. Thanks for the invitation to join.
You had a chance to introduce yourself, when we did this 3 years ago. And I might ask the question a bit differently, which is when you got started in this business, you're a Princeton Kent Calder protege, right?
Yep, that's right.
And then Japan Economic Institute, which did great research in the 90s. But from that to where you are now and your time at the White House, that's a very different debate about Japan and Washington. You were there all the way. Now that you're really old like me, what's your take on that transition in the whole view of Japan and the U.S.?
It is incredible to look back over this arc because, in the day-to-day, sometimes you lose sight of how much things have changed. But when you step back, you really see it. I mean, when I first started working on Japan, 2 things were dominant. One, it was around the time of the first Gulf War. And that, I think, was really kind of the beginning of Japan's transformation into a real security partner. But it was a shock to the Japanese at the time, this sense that their post-war policies and approach to the international system were inadequate. Ton of pressure applied on the Japanese by the United States to contribute to the Gulf War. Materially, they were unable to, gave only a financial contribution. That set in motion a whole set of reforms and things that unfolded over the next decade. The other thing that dominated at the time was the trade frictions. This was a time of real friction between us over autos and remember Kodak and Fujifilm and all those kinds of issues that seem pretty quaint and silly right now. So this sense of Japan as an inadequate security partner and as an economic threat, that was the dominant theme at the time. And it's so different now. The strategic basis for the relationship is so much stronger. Despite the challenges that we face that I'm sure we'll get into, remarkable to look back over those 30 years and see how the relationship has changed. Maybe one other thing just to say is it wasn't inevitable that we would get here, right? It took hard work by people over the years, people like you and Kirk Campbell and Rich Armitage and Joe Nye and so many of our own mentors over the years who built the relationship that we have today. So I do think it's important to say it wasn't inevitable that we would end up here, but that's where we are.
Yeah, no, I do think in some ways, as the Chinese would say, we were on the right side of history, that the structure of international relations and U.S. and Japanese interests were on the side of those who wanted to strengthen the alliance. But in the 1990s, especially the early 90s, when George Friedman's book, The Coming War with Japan, came out, and even into the 2000s, even in 2010, 11, 12, there were still divisions within the Obama administration about whether strengthening the alliance with Japan made sense because China was so important commercially and important to climate. Those debates now seem, in the U.S. at least, to be largely over. And you don't even have, I expected pushback when I wrote a book a few years ago that basically argued Japan under Abe had emerged as the strategic thought leader in Asia. I thought I'd get pushback. I didn't. People kind of thought, policy officials, scholars, and said, yeah, you're right. People respect that. Now, the problem, of course, is Japan's politics are not exactly stable, or at least post-Abe, they've not been stable. So Takaichi comes in some ways, in my view, an unlikely candidate, to be honest. I first met her in 1989 in the Big Island in Hawaii at a U.S.-Japan parliamentary exchange. I was the intern bag-carrying backbencher for the Japanese delegation, and she was doing that for the U.S. delegation. She worked as an intern in the U.S. Congress for Pat Schroeder, who was the AOC progressive of the day. She went back to Nara. Not quite sure what happened, but she came out an ultra-conservative. But she's off to a good start, isn't she? She's got very high support rate. She managed the Trump summit well. What's your take on the Takaichi government thus far?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think she's had a strong start. I think she's got at least the potential for a durable coalition. I mean, we'll see, but the Ishin partnership seems to be off to a good start. There are other conservative elements in the Democratic Party for the People. And so there's a possibility that we'll have a lasting, I think, center-right coalition, but it's very early. I do think she handled the Trump visit beautifully. And we can get into that, but just sort of creating the optics around it that were very positive. I mean, I was in Tokyo at the time. They had the Tokyo Tower lit up in red, white, and blue. Just little gestures that they knew would cater to President Trump. She had obviously thought a lot about the messages she wanted to give to him. This pledge to sort of move forward Japan's defense buildup to achieve 2% of GDP. It's not really 2% of GDP, by the way, but let's go with 2% of GDP. 2 years early, build a new defense plan. All that, I think, was well done and well received. And so I think, yeah, she's off to a strong start. I do think, my own view, Mike, I'd be interested in yours, is I think she very effectively draped the mantle of Abe around herself. And, for good reason. That is her sort of pedigree in the party. But I do think eventually she's going to have to sort of put her own stamp on where Japan is headed, what these national security strategy documents are going to look like. What is her vision for Japan and for the future? But look, I mean, strong start, certainly relative to where we've been over the last few years, right?
We'll get into the next national security strategy, defense strategy, midterm defense plan. I'm going to ask you to comment on it, but also to redesign it. If you were emperor, that doesn't work. Actually, emperor doesn't have that power under the post-war constitution. If you were a powerful leader in Japan, how would you do it? But since you and I both worked on these summits before, maybe we can geek out for a minute more on why it was such a success. I mean, in an academic way, at a structural level, the U.S. needs Japan. Absolutely needs Japan for technology, for forward basing, for reinforcing resilience in the Indo-Pacific. Indispensable, and Japan needs the U.S. So structurally, this was too big to fail. So that certainly helped. But it went much better than people expected. I mean, going into this, let me paint a different scenario. Howard Lutnick and the Commerce Secretary tells the president, Japan's not giving us enough specifics on this massive investment promise, which you, Mr. President, have called a sovereign wealth fund where the U.S. decides 90% or gets 90% of the profit. I mean, that is not what the Etchelmont deal was. So you could have seen Lutnick in particular going into the big boss and saying the Japanese are playing games. You could have seen potentially Bridge Colby or somebody at the Pentagon who had been pushing for, a pretty unrealistic, in the current environment, unrealistic 3.5% of GDP defense spend. At least that was the reporting. He sent officials to Tokyo to hit him hard on that. President didn't do that. He sort of like endorsed her plan to accelerate defense planning and potentially go above 2%, likely go above 2% in the next plan. He could have gone off on, as he did with Abe in almost every summit, how the whole region hates Japan and used to allow us for past trade deficits, Pearl Harbor, various other things that came up. It didn't happen. I mean, it was not only substantially important in output, but the tone. And I think probably a key person was Ambassador Glass in Tokyo. My sense also is that in MAGA land, in the Trump world, Japan's a good guy. Europeans, feckless, woke, open borders. But, for people like J.D. Vance or Stephen Miller, Japan is a good guy. And maybe even Takaichi in particular is kind of the Maloney of Asia. So it's sort of, I think people matter, people like Ambassador Glass, but also the ideology matters in these summits, as you know. And in a very odd way, she kind of resonated, I think. What do you think? You've done these summits. Of course, as we know, when we did it, the entirety of the success was due to our outstanding staff work.
Yes, it's the staff work. It's always the staff, except in this one case where it was.
Exactly.
Yeah, look, I think your last point is an important one about ideology. I think there was a perception that the president and Takaichi be ideologically aligned. Again, back to this Abe point, the close relationship that Trump had with Abe. I'm told that he genuinely liked her and that his comments about her that he sort of offered while he was in Tokyo were genuine and off the cuff. So I do think there's that sense of ideological alignment, personal alignment that was there. critical role of Ambassador Glass. I think he does seem to have been one of the key players behind the outcomes of the summit. And so I think in that sense, I think Tokyo is blessed with an effective ambassador, one who has good ties into the White House. And that's always, as you know, the most critical thing. I do think, though, it's also fair to point out that in some ways, the potential seeds of friction were, I'm going to mix metaphors here, papered over, by which I mean, like if you look at the two fact sheets that came out on the deals, for example, the 21 or so deals that were announced that were connected to this investment fund, the U.S. fact sheet talks about commitments on the part of those companies related to those projects. The Japanese fact sheet talks about interest on the part of companies in those projects. Similarly, on the defense spending issue, agreed. They got around that with Takaichi's focus on accelerating the 2% timeline and then the plans ahead over the next year to build a new defense plan. But that's sort of, if you think about it, sort of kicks the can down the road. I think it's quite possible that we will revisit this question of defense spending a year from now, because I think the Japanese likely to go north of 2%. I think there's a big question about how far north they can go. And then the question on the Trump team's plate will be whether to make that an issue or not. So I think it's a combination of effective stewardship from the ambassador, ideological alignment at the leader level, or at least the perception thereof, then a pretty effective way of dancing around the most difficult issues for the time being, but with seeds of friction potentially to come.
I wonder whether part of this also was, I mean, obviously Takaichi needed to get this summit right politically. She was Abe's protege. Getting the U.S., getting Trump right was part of his mandate. Japanese people didn't particularly like Donald Trump, but they wanted the alliance managed and they wanted to see Japan's agency and influence. So Abe delivered and she delivered. So politically for her, nobody ran against her in the LDP presidential race. Nobody even ran, not even the communists, I think, ran in the general election against the alliance. So she had a lot of room. But, Trump's politics were different. And I wonder whether the government shut down some of the polling, the reaction to the tariffs, meant his bandwidth was limited. And, Trump, everything, everywhere, all at once, shock and awe strategy. We may have seen in the Japan, Korea, Australia summits kind of the high water mark of some of that shock and awe, because just reduced political bandwidth because of the government shutdown and tariffs.
The reduced political bandwidth. And I think, probably as a political matter, the president needed these trips to go well, too, and needed to demonstrate that his approach on trade and tariffs and investment in the United States was yielding concrete outcomes. So I do think that was part of it. I mean, the stops in Korea and Malaysia, all the stops were quite, I think, positive, right? And clearly the president, I think, entered those meetings with the mindset that he wanted them to be successful and not combative. So that is part of it too. No question.
And important to point out, this is not just a random political variable. The reason he needed them to go well is because the Congress, the American public, cares about our alliances in Asia. It may not be in the top 10 or even 20 list of things they care about, but they do care. They do like Japan. They like Australia. They think China's a threat. So there was a reason he couldn't mess with them and needed to show presidential leadership. And, on the whole, really did. Let's talk about the defense.
Can I just say just one other point on that, Mike? I mean, I think, one of the things that was lost a bit in the coverage is Secretary Hegseth had his own sort of engagements with the Japanese the next day, right? Well, yeah, he had a bilat with Koizumi. He also went with the president down to Yokosuka for the event there. Everything I'm told is that those engagements that he had were very positive too. So I think, in the kind of the defense minister to defense minister space, also a sense of reassurance that I've heard from the Japanese that part of the alliance relationship is still strong.
Yeah, you and I both interact enough from time to time with the Australian Defence Forces, the JSDF, Indo-PACOM, to know that for all the friction and uncertainty at the political level, the military to military relationships are very solid and moving forward. And there's a level of trust. You and I have worked on this a long time that's unprecedented, despite everything, between the uniformed militaries. All right, let's talk about the defense plan. So she is taking Kishida's 5-year plan, which was aimed to hit 2% of GDP. I know it's 2% based on including the Coast Guard and the dateline when you start. And if you want to go into the mathematics of it, go ahead. But it's as much of a 2% as NATO. And it's supposed to finish a year from now, but she's accelerating that, starting the 5-year plan early, national security strategy from that national defense strategy, midterm 5-year defense buildup plan, the procurement plan, probably all hitting roughly simultaneously this later next year, is I think the plan is that what I'm hearing.
Yep.
What are you expecting from it? To increase defense spending, she's got to either issue bonds or taxes, and it sounds like she's going to do bonds. Bond market didn't like that when she got elected. What are you expecting from the plan in terms of its political momentum, priorities, and spending?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is, I mean, you're right about the numbers. You can noodle on the numbers if you want to, but the bottom line is this has been a pretty transformative buildup. We shouldn't lose sight of that. This was a country that had a policy of limiting defense spending to 1% of GDP for 50 plus years. And they've basically done what they said they were going to do, right? They have achieved, or they're going to achieve, the 2% mark early in a really comprehensive and broad buildup. My sense of what the rationale behind this decision to curtail the existing plan, build a new one early, two things. First, the practical problem that the current 5-year plan was designed at a time when the yen was 108 to the dollar, and now it's 155. So the purchasing power of the yen has cratered in the period since that plan was announced. And so that's had all sorts of cascading effects. So some insulation of that, because a certain sort of portion of the Japanese defense budget is purely sourced within Japan, but obviously it increases the cost of procurement significantly. So, for example, investments in munitions stockpiles, I think, fell short of where the Japanese had hoped that they would be. So part of the purpose there is to address that challenge, the shortfalls from the first 5-year plan that are exchange rate related. Second piece, I think, is the impact of the war in Ukraine and how technology is changing dramatically the way we all think about the battlefield. And so the rise of autonomy, uncrewed systems, mobility, the need for large-scale data fusion, diversified fires, all these kinds of things, I think, really brought home for the Japanese. So I think in this next plan, you're going to see heavy investments in uncrewed autonomous systems, affordable mass as a way of strengthening Japan's air defenses, among other things. And then the other area I think you're going to see heavy investment in is space-based capabilities for ISR and tracking, for communications, a systematic effort to develop their own autonomous comms and ISR architecture. I think there are risks in that for the United States. We can get into that if you like. But I think these are going to be the major focuses. And I think, from my point of view, that I think all that is generally good. I think the biggest risk I see is maybe, as part of this, a real effort to strengthen Japan's own defense industrial base, which is natural, right? Every country wants to have a strong indigenous defense industrial base. But you can take that too far, right? And end up with systems that cost too much and yield less capability. And I think there's some risk around that, particularly when I think about the space-based capabilities Japan is planning to invest in. But look, I think in general, these are the capability areas that make sense, and they reflect a lot of serious thinking about what Japan needs.
Yeah. Koksanka.
You wrote a book about this.
That was my dissertation. It's hard to tell taxpayers you're going to increase defense spending and spend it on U.S. or British or French production. So there's a natural political impulse to say we're going to create jobs, we're going to build it at home. She's cranked that up. She has part of her economic stimulus plan is defense production. And I think the burden sharing pressure from the Trump administration, which is needed, I think we both agree, coupled with uncertainty about the U.S. commitment, or at least enough uncertainty in the air that companies in Japan, but also in Europe or Korea are saying, well, heck, the Americans want us to have more defense capability, and gosh, we're not really sure they're reliable, so we better do this ourselves. The political atmospherics right now are a bit unhealthy. It's not binary. It's not all indigenous or all imported. You have any country, even the U.S., of course, the F-35, the F-16 is made around the world. So it's not binary. It's the right mix. But I'm with you. I think there's a risk that Japan will lean in the current environment a little too heavily in the Koksanka indigenous defense production direction and create some gold-plated. I worry about satellites. I worry about fighters. GCAP might be a good idea, but I think it's not being driven. We're going to get angry mail. I'm not sure it's a mission-driven program for Japan. I think it's an industrial policy thing. Too early to say for sure because there isn't yet something flying. So we'll see. For some things like munitions, absolutely, or shipbuilding. Actually, it's in our interests to have that industrial capacity in the Western Pacific, in the U.S. interest, because we need munition stockpiles. We need sustainment and shipbuilding. But some of the high-end tech stuff, it's not binary, but it feels like the momentum is kind of in the Koksanka indigenous direction in ways that in a limited defense environment are, well, let's just say not optimal.
Yeah. Totally agree. And I think in intensifying, I think in that direction, I'd agree with you in your point about space in particular. There's some programs, for example, that from what I understand, the defense ministry is trying to do essentially entirely on its own with Japanese industry only. Other areas, like, for example, the IT backbone for the cloud architecture that will support the SDF. Smaller example, but a preference for indigenous solutions when there are international ones that would provide far more capability. So from the sort of the small to the big, I see some risk there. But look, I think all of us, to step back and be fair about this, the Japanese going north of 2% of GDP is a hugely welcome development from a U.S. perspective. And if the cost of it is a little more for their own industry, then I think that's a cost that the United States should be willing to bear, right?
Oh, I mean, if you had to choose between this defense policy and the next defense plan and any other point in Japanese post-war history, you'd overwhelmingly pick where we are right now. So we're not whining.
Right.
We're just looking for optimal outcomes. I also do think the focus on the cloud, more broadly, command and control architecture is really important. This kind of gets to a foundational question about alliances that goes back to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars. Thucydides had this argument that smaller allies, Milos and so forth, aligned with Athens and Sparta, had this dilemma between entrapment and abandonment. And if they were too close to the big ally, they'd lose sovereignty. They'd be entrapped. They'd be pulled into wars with Sparta they didn't want. But if they tried to keep their distance, they wouldn't deter Sparta, and they'd get swallowed up like the sheep that's not with the flock. So this is the oldest story of alliance relations. It's true. It's more acutely true when you're in a threatening environment. So New Zealand faces this less than Japan. Portugal faces it less than Poland. But Japan and increasingly Australia have this dilemma. Japan always has. And you can understand anxiety about putting your command and control architecture in the cloud or in an American tech company's orbit or program.
Totally.
I think, though, this is just where we are. And we are in an era where Japan, Australia allies talk about sovereignty all the time. Trump, J.D. Vance talk about basically not getting entrapped with smaller allies, not more about Europe. I mean, the big countries also have this entrapment abandonment. The politics are making noise, but the reality is to deter China, there is no option. We are going to be more mutually interdependent, and that's just going to be something that has to be navigated. I don't know if you're following some of the command and control and battle space management architecture, AI-driven software, but it is possible to have an American system that sovereign capabilities intact, hermetically sealed capabilities can plug into for coalitions.
Yes.
So I think there might be technology solutions. Are you tracking that? It's not very public, and to be honest, I don't fully understand it, but there are some technology solutions to this sovereignty problem, it seems to me.
Tracking it broadly, and I actually think, Mike, Australia is a good example of a country that is successfully adopting some of these U.S. technologies, but doing so in a way that preserves sovereignty, that localizes some of the most sensitive data in a way that the Australian government wants, provides sort of unique encryption that gives the Australian government a sense of confidence in the security. So yes, I think there is a way to square that circle, but at the end of the day, this is a political problem, right? And, these are the conversations I have at the Ministry of Defense, which is, how they say, understood that the tech is better, but how do I persuade this larger political ecosystem that we should trust American technology? So that's definitely the background. But look, at the end of the day, I agree with you. I think, for the Japanese, there really is no plan B. I do find it interesting. Plan A is the alliance, right? The strong alliance. Then there isn't a plan B. I mean, I do find it interesting that there is a more systematic effort, I think, than ever before to strengthen ties with other like-minded countries. Australia is at the top of that list. But also there's more engagement of NATO and European partners than I think we've seen before. Some of that is driven in a result of GCAP. But, so an effort to diversify, but there's nothing that will replace the alliance, certainly not in the near term. And so at the end of the day, the United States needs it too. And that's what serves to keep us together. And to go back to where we started the conversation is a reason why the summit ultimately went well, despite all the potential for friction.
As the British Foreign Secretary said to a bunch of whining Europeans in the Reagan administration, everything you say about the Americans is true, but they're the only Americans we have. I think a lot of academics and journalists are spilling a lot of ink about this hedging or plan B, where Japan does more with Australia, talk about doing the Quad without the Americans, IP4, NATO, and Europe. There's a lot of that. I'd just make two observations. One is it is absolutely in U.S. interests. It's what we try to do in government. And the second is, if you look at it closely, it's all predicated on the hub and spokes. The U.S. is still the hub and the provider for strategic capabilities, global security and so forth. So, the next president may come in and look at the really incredible Japan-Australia connection or Europe-NATO interest in Asia and not change a single thing, maybe even accelerate.
Right. These things are not zero sum. No. Right. They're not.
But academics and journalists often like to portray this as a ha-ha, see what's happening. The one exception, I think you'd agree with this, is defense procurement. Because the quote-unquote hedging about American uncertainty, as we were discussing earlier, does shape the politics of decisions on things like cloud computing for command and control, fighter aircraft. These are national programs. It's about sovereignty. So in some ways, though, the U.S. system is able to correct, because part of the push for these indigenous capabilities is releasability limitations on the U.S. side. We don't share the crown jewels. We black box things on the U.S. side. And historically, the U.S. has often adjusted to stay in the game. So this might even be healthy pressure on the U.S. system to improve procurement reform. So it's not just domestic, but foreign military sales, ITAR, and international trade. I don't know if you're tracking that, the big Pentagon plans for defense procurement reform. If it ends up being a Buy in America supercharged fortress, it'll be a failure. But if they also reform foreign military sales, ITAR, export controls to allow more integration of defense industrial work with Japan and Korea and Australia and NATO, it's good. Are you tracking that debate?
I am tracking that a bit. And I think, first of all, I think, some of the initial reforms that the administration has announced related to sort of restructuring how we do FMS, the kind of the bureaucratic arrangements, putting DSCA under the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. I think all this is actually potentially quite good and could lead to sort of more integration between our own acquisition plans and how we think about foreign military sales. So that's potentially good. I think where the administration is not yet given a clear signal is where they come down on co-production, which is a big priority for the Japanese, of course. Understandably, that's not going away. But there hasn't been a whole lot of momentum behind the things that were sort of started under Biden continue. That's all good. But there aren't new things that are being brought forward. And so that's one area of concern I have, because that's one way to address this kokusanka instinct, is to have more opportunities where we're building stuff together in Japan that sort of provides them with the supply chain security that they want, but also results in capability that benefits both of us, right?
Absolutely right. And you look, we're less than 2% of global shipbuilding right now. Japan and Korea are over a third together. contested logistics. Getting stuff across the Pacific in a fight will be ugly. So having as much sustainment, repair, production, depot maintenance in Japan, Korea, Australia, Guam, as possible is good. We tend to make all the wrong moves before we make the right move. I think people know we need to go there. We're really geeking out, Chris. I hope we're not losing people, but the reality is that alliances are either real or not, depending on command and control relationships, defense industrial relationships. Most people don't study that in school, but that's the engineering that matters. And the other one that matters, and you've been right in the middle of it your whole career, is the intelligence relationship.
Yeah.
There's a lot of buzz. You and I are both guilty of sort of floating the idea Japan someday notionally should aspire to, maybe someday if they eat all their Wheaties, Five Eyes, the most intimate intelligence sharing relationship in the history of the world, really. US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. It's not going to happen easily. It's not going to happen soon. The aspiration's good. But where do you rate the intelligence relationship right now with Japan and Japan's capabilities and the potential that Japan does become step by step, maybe even associated with an intimate grouping like Five Eyes?
Real capabilities and getting better, I think. Certainly some of the space-based stuff that already exists, the imagery sharing that we do, Japanese provide value, signals intelligence collection. I mean, it's also true that Japan has historically a weak intelligence community. I think one of the most important things that has not really been covered that's part of Takaichi's agenda is creating a stronger central intelligence organization under the cabinet office. It's not yet clear what that means. I think we're going to see over the course of the next few months what the concept is. But even a central analytic organization that brings together all the information that the Japanese intelligence community collects and provides a fused analytic capability that supports the prime minister, that would be a huge step forward. Would raise the value of Japan as an intelligence partner. I think potentially produce more momentum behind this Five Eyes discussion that you mentioned. I mean, it just drives me nuts, Mike, that we can more easily share intelligence on China with our British friends, no offense to our British friends, than we can with the Japanese, who are easily our closest partners when it comes to the China challenge today. So we've got to do something about this. And hopefully this reform that Takaichi is talking about, we don't know enough about it yet, but hopefully it will result in something that can move that part of the relationship forward.
Tell me if you disagree. I think the intelligence world in Japan is still largely captured by the original bureaucracies. So
The
CSIRO,
police.
the cabinet intelligence function, is basically the police. The foreign ministry's external intelligence analysis function is just the foreign ministry. And then JDIH is just the uniformed guys, sort of emulating the DIA in the US. This will be a slight tinkering unless she does something about that.
I agree.
Which probably means taking the INR intelligence function of the foreign ministry for external intelligence analysis, setting aside human and covert operations, which I think is a much more complicated discussion, but just the analysis bit, taking that, frankly, out of the foreign ministry and having them also report to the cabinet, and then taking CSIRO or whatever this other function is and have it also be independent reporting to the cabinet. And then, the Japan Defense Agency used to be dominated by the police and the finance ministry to make sure that there was no real military. Now there is, as you know, and we know them well, a homegrown, highly capable defense ministry bureaucracy led now by our friend Yamato Taro.
Yeah. Amazing.
That's going to have to happen for the intel world. There's going to need to be a non-bureaucratized intelligence culture. And that's a very heavy lift because she's taken on, the police in particular, but the foreign ministry as well, very powerful bureaucracies. And she's got a lot on her plate. So we'll see. There will be some progress, I think. The transformation, I'm not sure. But we'll watch that space.
Yeah, look, I'm somewhat skeptical myself, but I think what's positive is at least an acknowledgement that intelligence should be a higher priority and deserves real political level attention to fix what's broken in the Japanese system.
And to your point about China, the Japanese analysis of China from the trading companies, from the banks, from think tanks, and from within the foreign ministry and the government is really good. But importantly, it's really different. Look, the Japanese have been competing with China for over 2,000 years, and you will hear from Japanese experts takes on China you don't hear in Washington or London
Totally.
or Canberra. And Often very right. Often very right.
When I was in the CIA, we would bring some of our China experts to Japan and they talk with Japan's China analysts, and they found it incredibly valuable, particularly those working on the internal political stuff.
Yep.
Great insights that the Japanese had access to sources that we didn't at that time. So I agree. There's real capability there. What's lacking has been the ability to sort of knit it all together in a comprehensive strategic picture, but in particular areas, very strong.
So let's spend just a minute before we finish on China now, and then on the other partners in the region. But on China, as we speak, Beijing is unleashing unholy fury on Takaichi. It's very reminiscent of what they did to Abe in 2012 when he came back. Very reminiscent. Abe held to his guns, and eventually the Chinese came around, but only after he won some big elections. I had lunch with him actually in the Prime Minister's office in July 2013, the Monday with Funabashi Yoichi, the think tanker. And we had lunch with Abe the Monday after he won the upper house election. And it was clear he was there for the long haul. And he said that morning, the Kante, the Prime Minister's office phones were ringing off the hook from Chinese provincial premiers, business leaders who wanted finally to be able to come to Japan to do business deals. He kind of chuckled. We'll see if Takaichi can hold it out. But what do you think? How do you think Tokyo is looking at this right now? Been there, seen that, got a hold of our guns, or do you think they're very worried?
I think they're somewhat worried, but also sort of hopeful that the Chinese will find a way to climb down. Just stepping back for a second, I think it's important to say up front that the only thing surprising about what Takaichi said to the Diet about Japan's possible role in a Taiwan contingency, the only thing surprising is that she said it publicly. The content of it has been the premise of U.S.-Japan dialogue on the Taiwan challenge for more than a decade, right? And was the premise of the 2015 security legislation that Abe pushed through. I was looking back through some notes today, when the first guidelines revision happened in 1997, Mike, and I think you were part of that. I think the Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Kajiyama at the time made an oblique reference to the possibility that Taiwan was included in the area under which U.S.-Japan cooperation under the guidelines at that time might take place. So this is not new. That was 30 years ago. So from my point of view, the Chinese are testing Takaichi, trying to put her on her back foot, testing the United States, importantly. I think, Mike, you mentioned 2012. I think one of the really important things that also took place, Abe being tough, but also the U.S. coming in very strongly to say our treaty commitments apply to the Senkaku Islands, and make no mistake about that, in some very senior level engagements in both Beijing and elsewhere. That's the one piece that I would hope to see more of if this continues. Sort of a stronger U.S. articulation of our position on these things, particularly since what Takaichi was talking about was Japanese support for the United States in the Taiwan contingency. So that sort of, I think, by itself invites more from Washington on this. But I think she's going to hold her ground. There's no sense I have that anyone believes that she needs to back down.
No, she'll hold her ground because she believes it, and there's no political merit for caving. And I don't think any serious aspirant to replace her is going to come out and say you should cave. It's political suicide in Japan. And I suspect that in Zhongnanhai, the decision-making in China did not involve a kind of consideration of how Japan would react. I think it was thousands of years of instinct and vitriol and domestic Chinese audiences driving this mostly. And then
that's fair.
Also deterring Japan, trying to slow down momentum on this. But the real wild card is the U.S. Because in 2012 and 13, when they went at Abe, calling him Lord Voldemort in British newspapers, and really fanning out in Washington and London and Canberra and elsewhere, not just in the press, but with think tanks, with members of Congress, trying to get them to turn on Abe. And honestly, Chris, in 2012 and 13, I think the Chinese side sniffed an opportunity. The Obama administration was divided on Abe at first. No doubt about it.
That's true.
And they could sense that. In the end, the administration, they closed ranks. And now with Donald Trump, as well as the summit with Takaichi went, you can tell he's looking at the gold ring as the summit with Xi in presumably April next year. And that's got to have Takaichi's people a little bit nervous, unless the White House says something. And I don't think they will. It incentivizes Beijing to think we might get lucky. We might as well keep doing this till April. Let's see where Trump comes out when we're talking trade deals. And maybe we can get him to say something that really doesn't make any sense to him, but in an East Asia context is completely humiliating for Takaichi. And you can be sure that Ambassador Yamada and everyone else is going to be working overtime in Washington to prevent that. But, this is a hard president to predict.
Yeah. I mean, so far, our embassy in Tokyo, Ambassador Glass, has had some good, solid statements on this. But I think at the end of the day, what the Chinese are going to be watching is what Washington has to say.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you. I think the Japanese are nervous about this. And I think, to the extent that there's a perception here that weighing in on this may place at risk the goals in the U.S.-China relationship, I agree there's some unpredictability there that is unfortunately concerning for me.
Where you might see some movement is in the Congress, though.
Yes.
And that could have some impact. Very quickly.
In fact, we're already seeing that, right? Yep.
Yeah. So the regional security partnership building is absolutely core to Abe. I mean, Maihara, the DPJ, wanted to do it. Koizumi did it when he was prime minister. This is part of Japan's playbook. Japan, frankly, more than Australia or India or Korea or any other country in the region, is trying to build a pickup team for this game. And we almost don't need to talk about the Australia part. The decision by Australia to procure the Mogami as their next frigate from Japan, the momentum is very, very strong. India, Japan strong. I personally think there will be a Quad summit, maybe as a counterweight to the Xi-Trump summit next year. But the one you and I have banged our heads against for years, which seems to be going pretty well, in spite of Takaichi's ideology and Lee Jae-myung's ideology, is Japan-Korea. Any hopeful, thoughtful, pessimistic final? Because that may be the one that at the end of the day, not in a contingency, but in terms of geopolitics, that may be the one that matters the most and that is the hardest for Japan.
I totally agree. I think it's the one that matters the most just because of the geography and the U.S. presence in both countries, the overlap between what a Korean contingency and a Taiwan contingency might involve, for all those reasons. Look, I think a week ago I had a conversation about this topic and I was pretty optimistic. There are some things that have happened over the last week that have made me somewhat less optimistic. But look, overall, I'm positive. I think a few things. I think Takaichi has come into the role quite pragmatic and has said all the right things about the importance of the relationship with South Korea. Lee Jae-myung has also continued to emphasize the importance of the relationship with Japan. I think in a time when there's this uncertainty over the relationship with the United States for both of them, there's probably a shared sense that they need each other. So that's part of it too. Victor Cha wrote a book about this a long time ago. I think there are dimensions of this that are rooted in that dynamic. I think the question is going to be, can each side demonstrate restraint over the political temptations to take steps that will be, popular with particular domestic constituencies, but will inflame the bilateral relationship. And in Takaichi's case, it's things like, Yasukuni visits. In Lee Jae-myung's case, it's things like Tokdo and, forced labor and that sort of thing. So far, the initial signs are good. I will note that, there was supposed to be a logistical exercise just over the last week in which the Japanese were going to refuel a South Korean aircraft. That exercise was canceled after the aircraft allegedly flew close to Tokdo. Some other exchanges have been since canceled. So I'm a little bit concerned that we're starting to head down this funnel again. But I do think the political messaging at the top remains good, and that keeps me hopeful. And I think fundamentally the interests are aligned. I mean, the other point I would make, and you know this better than I do, Mike, I think the South Korean view of China is just very different from where it was a decade ago. And that also, I think, leaves the South Koreans in a different place about the relationship with Japan than might have been true in the past. So for those structural reasons, I choose to be optimistic.
I agree with that. And the Korea-Japan story over the last 6-7 decades is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, fall in a hole. A couple of years later,
several years,
step forward. I hope I'm not jinxing us all, but I feel like the big holes we're not going to fall in as much as before, but there will be backward movement from time to time. We do have a very ironic advantage in having the most left-wing candidate in Korea win and the most right-wing candidate in Japan win. The old Nixon goes to China. If anyone can keep this moving, it's those two. And so far, they both are ideological but pragmatic and seem to want to serve their country's interests. Chris, this has been great. We'll get you on in, maybe not 3 years wait next time, but brilliant stuff. Thanks very much.
Great to be here, Mike. Really appreciate it. It's always fun.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.